Ella Fitzgerald was in her hotel room in Los Angeles when the phone rang on August 5, 1962. She picked it up expecting her manager or maybe a booking call. Instead, she heard words that made time stop. Marilyn Monroe is dead. Ella sank onto the bed, phone still pressed to her ear, barely hearing the rest. Found in her home, apparent overdose. 36 years old. Marilyn, gone. This is the story of what happened 3 days later at a small private memorial service, of Ella standing before a microphone, trying to sing for someone who had once changed her life, of the moment grief overwhelmed her mid-performance and she had to choose between stopping or continuing, and of the debt of gratitude paid through tears to a friend who would never hear it. Ella and Marilyn's friendship had begun 7 years earlier in 1955, not through Hollywood parties or mutual fame, but through an act of courage that broke barriers in a way that would change both their lives. In 1955, Ella Fitzgerald was already a successful recording artist. She'd been singing professionally for over 20 years since that night at the Apollo in 1934. She had Grammy nominations, international respect, was widely recognized as one of the greatest jazz vocalists alive. Duke Ellington called her voice the most perfect instrument in jazz. Critics praised her technical precision and emotional range, but success in recordings didn't translate to certain venues. Specifically, it didn't translate to the Mocambo nightclub in Los Angeles, one of the most prestigious, glamorous clubs in the entire city. The Mocambo was where Hollywood's elite went to be seen. Frank Sinatra performed there, Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, the biggest names in entertainment. But when Ella's manager approached the owner about booking her, the answer was always no. The owner, Charlie Morrison, made it clear without saying it explicitly. He wanted mainstream white performers for his wealthy white clientele. A black jazz singer, no matter how talented, no matter how many Grammys she'd been nominated for, didn't fit the image he wanted. Ella's manager tried everything, offered lower fees to make it easier, emphasized her prestige and critical acclaim, pointed out her Grammy nominations and the respect she commanded in the jazz world, showed reviews calling her brilliant, incomparable, the finest vocalist of her generation. Nothing worked. Morrison was polite but firm. The Mocambo wasn't interested. This was crushing for Ella, though she tried not to show it. The Mocambo represented something beyond just another venue. It represented acceptance by Hollywood's elite. It represented crossing over from black jazz club status to mainstream prestige. Being turned down again and again felt like being told, you're good but not for us. You're talented but not for our audience. You're excellent but you're black, and that's the problem we won't say out loud. Then, in early 1955, Marilyn Monroe heard about the situation. She'd recently met Ella briefly at an industry event and had been struck by both Ella's voice and her dignity. When Marilyn learned the Mocambo was refusing to book Ella, she was angry, really angry. Marilyn herself had been underestimated and dismissed for years. Studio executives saw her as just a pretty face, a body to photograph, not a serious actress or intelligent woman. She knew what it felt like to be reduced to an image, to have your actual abilities ignored because of something about your appearance. So Marilyn picked up the phone and called Charlie Morrison directly. I heard you're not booking Ella Fitzgerald, Marilyn said. Miss Monroe, the Mocambo has a certain clientele. Book Ella Fitzgerald for a week, Marilyn interrupted. If you do, I'll personally sit at a front table every single night she performs. I'll arrive early. I'll stay the whole show. I'll pose for photographs. I'll talk to the press. I'll make it the most photographed, most talked about engagement you've ever had at the Mocambo. Morrison was silent for a moment. Marilyn Monroe, the biggest sex symbol in America, the woman every magazine wanted on their cover, every photographer wanted to shoot, was offering to personally attend every performance. The publicity would be staggering. Every newspaper, every magazine, every gossip columnist would cover it. The Mocambo would be the center of Hollywood attention for an entire week. Every night, Morrison asked, every single night, front row, the whole show. I'll book her, Morrison said, and he did. Suddenly, after months of rejection, Ella Fitzgerald was booked at the Mocambo. Her manager called with the news. Ella was thrilled but confused. What had changed? Then she learned about Marilyn's intervention, about the promise Marilyn had made, about the condition that had gotten her booked. Ella called Marilyn to thank her, to tell her she didn't have to actually follow through, that the booking alone was enough. I want to, Marilyn said. I want people to hear you, really hear you, not as that colored singer, but as the brilliant artist you are, and if my sitting there makes them pay attention, then that's what I'll do. She sat at a front row table every single night of Ella's run. Photographers came to capture Marilyn and captured Ella's performance in the process. The press coverage was massive. More importantly, Hollywood's elite followed Marilyn's lead. If Marilyn Monroe thought Ella Fitzgerald was worthy of attention, then she must be. Suddenly, Ella was the performer everyone wanted to see. Other prestigious venues that had turned her down started calling. Ella never forgot what that meant. It wasn't just publicity. It was Marilyn using her massive cultural power to break a racial barrier. Marilyn could have attended passively. Instead, she made it a statement. This black woman belongs on this stage. This black woman deserves your attention and respect. After that engagement ended, Ella called Marilyn to thank her properly. What started as a thank you call turned into a 2-hour conversation. They discovered unexpected common ground, two women who'd grown up poor, who'd been underestimated, who'd clawed their way to success in industries that wanted to use them without respecting them. Marilyn had grown up in foster homes, never knowing stability or unconditional love. Ella had lost her mother young and lived on Harlem streets as a teenager before her Apollo breakthrough. Both knew what it meant to survive. Marilyn was fighting to be seen as more than a sex symbol, to be recognized as a serious actress and intelligent woman. Ella was fighting to be seen as more than a colored singer, to be recognized simply as a great vocalist. Both knew what it meant to be reduced to a label. They became friends, not Hollywood's superficial friends who air-kissed at parties, but genuine ones. Phone calls late at night when both couldn't sleep. Lunches at quiet places where they could talk without being mobbed. Marilyn asking Ella about music and phrasing and how to use your voice emotionally. Ella asking Marilyn about acting and presence and how to command a camera. One particular afternoon in 1956, they met at a small restaurant in West Hollywood. Marilyn arrived wearing dark sunglasses and a scarf, trying to be inconspicuous. Ella was already seated. "You don't have to hide from me," Ella had said gently. "It's exhausting," Marilyn admitted, taking off the sunglasses. "Everyone wants Marilyn Monroe. Nobody wants Norma Jean. Sometimes I wish I could just be a person." "I understand that," Ella said. "People want the voice. They want the perfect performance. They don't want to know about the rehearsals or the doubts or the person behind it." They talked for 3 hours that day, about loneliness at the top, about being surrounded by people but feeling alone, about the pressure to always be perfect, always be the image everyone expected. Ella saw beyond Marilyn's bombshell image to the intelligence underneath, the woman who read Dostoevsky and James Joyce, who studied method acting seriously with Lee Strasberg, who quoted poetry and analyzed literature, who was far smarter than the dumb blonde persona Hollywood forced on her, and she played for survival. Marilyn saw beyond Ella's professional perfection to the insecurities underneath, the woman who worried she wasn't pretty enough, wasn't glamorous like other female performers, who carried wounds from a difficult childhood and being told she'd never amount to anything, who sometimes felt like an outsider even in her own success, too black for white audiences, too polished for some black audiences, never quite belonging anywhere completely. They met maybe once a month when schedules allowed, sometimes just coffee, sometimes longer conversations, always genuine, always real in ways neither could be with most people in their lives. As the years passed, Ella watched Marilyn's struggle, the difficult marriages, the studio conflicts, the increasing dependence on pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to get through the day. Ella worried but didn't know how to help. Marilyn assured her she was fine, even when clearly she wasn't. The last time they'd spoken was June 1962, 2 months before Marilyn's death. Marilyn had called Ella, sounding tired and sad. They talked for an hour. Marilyn thanked Ella for always treating her like a person rather than an image. Ella told Marilyn she was stronger than she knew. When they hung up, Ella had felt uneasy, something in Marilyn's voice, but she'd been busy with tour preparations and told herself Marilyn would be fine. Now Marilyn was dead, and Ella kept replaying that last conversation, wondering if there had been a cry for help she'd missed. The days after Marilyn's death were chaos. Press speculation, rumors, the public funeral at Westwood Village Memorial Park that drew massive crowds. Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's ex-husband, arranged everything and kept it relatively small, invited guests only, not the Hollywood spectacle some wanted. 3 days after Marilyn's death, on August 8th, there was a smaller, private memorial service for close friends. Not at the chapel, but at a private location. Perhaps 20 people, those who'd known Marilyn personally, not as a star but as a person. Ella received the invitation. Joe DiMaggio had personally requested her presence, knowing Marilyn had valued Ella's friendship. Ella almost didn't go. Her grief felt too raw, too personal, but she remembered the Mocambo, remembered Marilyn sitting at that front table every night, remembered the phone calls and lunches and genuine connection. She went. The service was simple, intimate. A room with chairs, some flowers, photographs of Marilyn at different ages. The attendees were mostly quiet, processing their grief privately. Joe DiMaggio stood at the front, looking devastated. He'd never stopped loving Marilyn despite their divorce. Everyone knew it. His grief was visible and profound. Someone asked Ella if she would sing, just one song, for Marilyn. Ella hesitated. She wasn't sure she could, but then she thought Marilyn had sat through multiple performances to help Ella's career. The least Ella could do was sing one song in her memory. She agreed. There was no microphone, no stage, just Ella standing at the front of the small room, 20 people watching, Joe DiMaggio looking at her with eyes that held oceans of pain. Ella had thought about what to sing. She chose Someone to Watch Over Me, a song about longing and loneliness and the hope for connection. A song Marilyn had mentioned loving once. Ella took a breath and began. Her voice filled the small room, pure, controlled, technically perfect as always. The melody carried weight, the lyrics taking on new meaning in the context of Marilyn's death. A woman who'd been watched by millions but truly seen by so few. Ella made it through the first verse, her voice steady, professional. The second verse began. The lyrics about wanting someone to understand you, to care about the real person behind the public image. And Ella's voice cracked. She tried to continue, got 3 more words out. Then her throat closed and tears started falling. She stood there, unable to sing, crying in front of 20 people at her friend's memorial service. For a moment she considered stopping, apologizing, sitting down, but then she thought about Marilyn sitting at that Mocambo table every single night, about the phone calls and the kindness and the friendship that had meant so much, about the debt she owed to a woman who would never hear this song. Ella took a shaky breath and kept singing. Her voice wasn't perfect now. It was broken by grief, interrupted by tears, rough with emotion. She had to stop between phrases to breathe, to gather herself. The technical precision was gone, but the emotion was everything. Every note carried the weight of friendship and loss and gratitude and regret. The song wasn't just being performed, it was being felt. People in the room started crying too, not just at Marilyn's death, but at Ella's visible grief. At watching someone push through pain to honor a friend, Joe DiMaggio's face was wet with tears. He mouthed thank you to Ella mid-song. Ella kept going, through the bridge, through the final verse, her voice wavering but never stopping, each word an act of love and remembrance. She sang the final note, quiet, broken but complete, then stood there, tears streaming down her face, unable to move. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Joe DiMaggio stood and walked to her. He embraced her, this baseball legend who'd loved Marilyn forever, hugging this singer who'd been Marilyn's friend. She would have been so moved, he whispered. Thank you. Ella could barely speak, just nodded against his shoulder. Others came to her afterward, thanked her, told her it was the most beautiful tribute. Ella heard the words but felt numb. She'd sung for Marilyn one last time. A fraction of the gift Marilyn had given her at the Mocambo, but offered with everything she had. The days after the memorial were difficult. Ella couldn't shake the grief, couldn't stop replaying that last phone conversation, couldn't stop wondering what if she'd understood better, reached out more, somehow prevented this. Her manager worried about upcoming performances. Ella was scheduled to appear in Chicago in a week. Could she do it? I have to, Ella said. Marilyn wouldn't want me to stop working. She fought to get me working. The Chicago performance came. Ella was professional, technically brilliant, perfectly controlled. But those who knew her well noticed something different, more emotion in her voice, more rawness, less perfect, but somehow more affecting. In interviews over the following months, Ella was asked about Marilyn. She always spoke carefully, respectfully, called her a dear friend, mentioned the Mocambo but not with the full story that came later, focused on Marilyn's kindness and intelligence. People saw her as a sex symbol, Ella would say. I saw her as a friend, someone who was generous and thoughtful, who used her fame to help others, who had a good heart. When pressed about Marilyn's death, Ella would say simply, she was troubled, she was in pain, I wish she'd known how much she was loved, I wish I'd told her more often. Years later, when Ella felt comfortable sharing more, she'd tell the Mocambo story in full, about Marilyn's intervention, about the barrier that broke because one white woman decided it should. Marilyn changed my career, Ella would explain. Before the Mocambo, certain doors were closed. After they opened, not because I suddenly got better, I was always good, but because Marilyn Monroe sat in that audience and made people pay attention. She used her power for someone else's benefit. How many people do that? The friendship between them became part of both their legacies. Stories circulated about their unlikely bond, about the sex symbol and the jazz singer, about how Marilyn had helped Ella and how Ella had sung through tears at Marilyn's memorial. In 1996, when Ella died, some obituaries mentioned her friendship with Marilyn, mentioned the memorial service, mentioned how Ella had broken down crying mid-song but kept singing anyway. The parallel was noted: two women who'd been underestimated, who'd fought for respect in industries that wanted to use them, who'd found friendship across racial lines in an era where that was rare, who'd helped each other in ways both public and private. Marilyn had given Ella credibility at a crucial moment, had used her platform to break a barrier. Ella had given Marilyn one final tribute, had sung through grief to honor a friend, had made sure Marilyn knew, even if only in memory, that she mattered beyond the image. August 8th. 1962, a small room, 20 people, one song sung through tears, not perfect, but perfect in its imperfection, because real friendship, real grief, real love, those things aren't polished. They're raw and messy and overwhelming. Ella Fitzgerald standing at Marilyn Monroe's memorial, crying so hard she could barely sing, but singing anyway. Because 7 years earlier, Marilyn had sat at a table every single night so Ella could sing. And this was Ella saying, "I remember, I'm grateful, you mattered, the debt paid, the friendship honored." The song sung through tears for a friend who would never hear it, but somehow, Ella believed, already knew.